My name is Dr. Catherine Collins. I'm a fellow here at the Oxford Centre for Life Writing and also a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the Department of Education. The planning for this colloquium came into being around about this time last year, and maybe I shouldn't reveal that the idea was hatched in the pub after a talk, although actually I think many of the best ideas are. Marcio Goldman, who is speaking today, as well as some of our other colleagues here in Oxford, David and Nanika, who are also here today, had just offered some very thought-provoking insights into the ways in which universities in the global south are responding to issues of diversity and diversification. We were left with a number of questions about institutions of higher education and what we might call diversity, which we were eager to explore further, such as the role of the university as a kind of rite of passage or a somewhat homogenizing ritual, perhaps, that goes some way to create the we that might ask the question, how can we diversify? One of the ways in which we thought we might explore this question was through a study of the lives of scholars of the global south. I was particularly eager to take up this theme as my current project, funded by the Leverhulme Trust, is one such effort. And so today represents, we hope and intend, the first of many opportunities to bring together scholars and writers and provide a space to explore this important and very topical issue. Thanks are due to Torch, huge thanks to Torch and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for granting us the funds to bring together this exceptional group of speakers from around the world, from Brazil, from India, South Africa, Puerto Rico, and of course those speakers themselves for making the journey to Oxford to share with us their time and their reflections. Also, I'd like to thank my colleagues, Ramon, Elizabeth, Elika, Nanika, David and Thomas, for their input and collaboration. And on that note, I think I'm going to hand over to Ramon, who wants to say a few words too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie. And my words are very short. I mean, I just wanted to thank very, very deeply and warmly Katie for having put it together so beautifully and in such a short time. And I wanted to say just a couple of things. When we started to discuss about this workshop as an outcome of the conversation we had last year with David, Marcio, and well, many of those who are in this room, one of the possibilities was to focus on the relationship, which is something I'm very interested in, between biography and decolonization, processes of decolonization in Africa. In particular, and in other parts of the world. And in fact, with this in mind, we not only organized this workshop, but also managed to get some funding through Torch to invite our colleague Antonio Tomás from the University of Cape Town, who has written an amazing biography of Amilcar Cabral, which is now being translated into English as I speak. Now, unfortunately, given the stupidity of the world in which we live, visa difficulties made it impossible for him to take advantage of this and to be here today. So I wanted to thank him as well and tell him how much we regret that he's not able to be here. And I hope that we'll manage to bring him at some point. And finally, just another thing I wanted to say is that I want to say thank you to Torch, which is a Center for Humanities, for being so generous towards anthropology, which actually belongs to the Division of Social Sciences. And it's particularly beautiful that they are doing that, because they have realized in the conversations we've been having for several years now that anthropology is really the odd one in social sciences, and we are really in between social sciences and anthropology and humanities. And with this effort, we also approach Torch and organize things with them. And many of the people that you're going to be listening to today, including some of the chairs, all the chairs, are people who are trying to branch and to reach humanities and anthropology, following some of our forefathers and foremothers. And one of them I want to mention because she is really one of the persons who has inspired my own interest in inscribing the individual, inscribing creativity and imagination in the study of social forms. And this is our very, very dear colleague, Wendy James, in a wonderful book, which is now almost 20 years old, in which she talks about inscribing creativity. And it is, I don't want to maybe do something that Katie wouldn't subscribe, but as far as I'm concerned, I would like to dedicate this workshop to Wendy and wish her she lives about 3 minutes from here, by the way, and she's gravely ill, so I'm sure that she would be here otherwise. So I wish her a very good recovery, and I hope that she will be among us very soon to keep on discussing how to inscribe the individual mind, the individual creativity in the social forms and social structures that we anthropologists are interested in. And thank you, Katie, again for having organized this event.
Well, hello everyone, and what a pleasure it is to see this company gathered together to talk about biographies and inscriptions in Global South history and experience. It's also my very great pleasure to welcome my colleague and friend, Supriya Chaudhuri, to give the keynote that is going to kick off the discussion today. There are extensive biographies on the program. However, biography is one of the things we're talking about today, so I'm just going to say a few words about Supriya. We were so delighted to host Supriya as one of the Global South visiting professors at Torch last academic year, and so happy too to have been able to invite her back this year, 2019 also. Supriya Chaudhuri is Professor Emerita in the Department of English, Jadavpur University, and she is in so many ways been part of and responsible for putting Jadavpur on the map as an intellectual hub of the Global South. Supriya has held visiting appointments at the University of Cambridge and the University of Paris-Sorbonne, and she has lectured at many universities in India and abroad. Her areas of interest are many and diverse, including Renaissance studies, philosophy and critical theory, Indian cultural history, urban studies, translation, and modernism. And some of her many publications, the more recent ones, include Commodities and Culture in the Colonial World, which came out last year, and Reconsidering English Studies in Indian Higher Education. Just before I invite you all to welcome Supriya to speak to us, I just want to give a quick sort of housekeeping announcement so that you know what to expect. Supriya will talk for a little under an hour, and then we'll have discussion, and then at about 2:05, 2:10, we will roll on seamlessly into the first panel discussion. Okay, so as it were, mentally time your bladders and your thirst to that. Of course, I'm not banning everyone from kind of dipping out. Sorry, I didn't mean this to be kind of, a laugh. But anyway, so there you go. So you know what to expect. And now please join me in welcoming Supriya Chaudhuri.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be back again. Thank you, Elika. Thank you, Ramon and Catherine, above all, for making it possible for me to be back here. And it's a tremendous pleasure to be part today of Katie's project and her conference. My paper is called Significant Lives, Biography, Autobiography, and Women's History in South Asia. And when I sent my title to Katie, I must have been recalling, though I didn't realize this at the time, a justly celebrated essay by Carolyn Steedman, published in 1992 in the journal History and Theory, which was subtitled Why Cleo Doesn't Care. And in that essay, partly reworked from her own recently published biography of the socialist educator Margaret Macmillan, Steedman suggested that the practice of biography allowed for us an observation about women's history. And this was, I quote here, an altered sense of the historical meaning and importance of women's or female insignificance. The absence of women from conventional historical accounts, discussions of this absence, and discussion of the real archival difficulties that lie in the way of presenting their lives in a historical context, are at the same time a massive assertion of the littleness of what lies hidden. A sense of that which is lost, never to be recovered completely, is one of the most powerful organizing devices of modern women's history. Now, Steedman sees herself, therefore, as extending what Elizabeth Fox Genovese, whom she quotes right here, had said more cryptically 10 years earlier, that women's history challenges mainstream history, not to substitute the chronicle of the female subject for that of the male, but rather to restore conflict, ambiguity, and tragedy to the historical process. Now, the sadness of this effect, Steedman said, was present in working class history too. But one contrast between working class history and female and women's history was that the lack of detail about working lives had, so she suggested, a greater prefigurative force. Oppression and repression have a meaning within the narrative structure of people's history and labor history in a way that is not the case in women's history. Now, for Steedman, then, female insignificance was meaningless in a strong sense. Meaning the women's absence from conventional historical accounts was meaningless in a strong sense. And having said this, Steedman proceeds in this dense and fascinating essay to note how meaning is made quite differently in the literary text, and she contrasts biography and the literary operation of biography to history writing, where she says the feminist aesthetic can go to work, as she puts it, writing polyvalency and fragmentation as resistance and critique of an existing patriarchal order. So biography and autobiography, literary forms that nevertheless lay a claim to the historical archive, certainly posit meaningfulness as a prime objective of their narrative projects in their different forms: spiritual, hagiographical, documentary, exemplary, confessional, official, tutelary, sensational, psychobiographical, and so on. And allowing for the necessary contrasts between the genres of biography and autobiography, and the textures of public and private spheres, about which, again, Steedman has a great deal to say, they offer up the model of a significant life, even though in the historical context that life story may, Steedman says, explain only itself. Now, she therefore, writing this biography that she had published the previous year, writing the historical biography of a woman, Margaret Macmillan, who had led a public life and had also written a biography of her sister, which Steedman wanted to read as a kind of autobiography. The problem of placing her subject's life within social and political history meant that the narrative closures of biography and autobiography, ending in the figure of a person, were in conflict with the open-endedness of history, and that various kinds of formal and disciplinary concerns were inextricably entangled in her own biographical project. Now, looking at women's lives in South Asia, as I want to do today, it's impossible to break free of those entanglements, to separate the strands of a narrative self-justification from the cobwebs of historical obscurity and neglect. Though I'd suggest that one way of understanding the problem would be to ask again what we mean by history. For the moment, however, I'll bracket that question and turn rather to actual biographies and autobiographies of South Asian women, paying attention to what I perceive as a disproportion or lack of balance between the two genres. I argue that while women's autobiographies have been of quite extraordinary importance to feminist scholarship in India and have been in many ways the single most important resource in constituting an archive of women's experience that might feed activism and theory, biographies of women are relatively scarce and, with some notable exceptions, unremarkable. For Indian biographers, Bentley's observation that geography is about maps, but biography is about chaps, is actually true. Biography in India is about chaps. By contrast, the first prose autobiography in the Bengali language, perhaps the first to be printed in any modern Indian language, was composed by a woman. From the second half of the 19th century to the beginning of the 21st, we have a substantial number of personal narratives that allow us to recover in their own words, within inverted commas, because I'm not quite sure whether this is always the case, the hidden lives of women and make space for them in a social imaginary that has important literary and aesthetic dimensions and exceptional ethical and cultural force. Most of these lives have precisely the kind of historical insignificance of which Steedman speaks, and yet through the act of narration itself, they gain resonance in textual space. Now, I want to illustrate this very briefly by saying a little bit about autobiography, but I will turn to biography in the major part of my discussion today. So let me start by citing two autobiographical narratives by women composed almost 150 years apart, but making an extraordinary cultural impact despite the insignificance of the lives that they record. The first is Rasha Sundari Devi's Amar Jibon, My Life, published in two parts in 1868 and 1897, the second part carrying a preface by the poet Rabindranath Tagore's elder brother, Jyotirindranath. The second is a memoir published only 10 years ago, Doyamuir Kotha, by Shunanda Shikdar, 2008, which won a number of literary prizes and was translated into English for the feminist publishers Zuban in 2017. Both works are set in rural East Bengal, and both authors would be unknown had they not written their personal histories. In Rasha Sundari's case, absolutely unknown, since there is no archival record of her existence at all. In the second, that of Shunanda Shikdar, who belongs to the modern biopolitics of official documentation, comparatively unknown, since her life records might exist, but the memoir's subject, the child Doyamui, who spent her first 10 years in the village of Dikpait in East Pakistan, would never have acquired the shape of a life. Now, Rasha Sundari's text, which I will just refer to rather briefly because it's well known, it's one of the prime examples, for example, in Tharu and Lalita's women writing in India. Rasha Sundari's text constitutes a foundational moment in South Asian women's writing because the whole focus of her narrative is on her acquiring the means of self-representation, that is, learning to read and write. And in this, she becomes, as she calls herself, Jitakshara, that is, a winner of words, rather than simply Sakshara, which means literate or somebody who can, lettered, who can write. This struggle that informs her autobiographical self-representation is carried on during her adult life after she is married at the age of 12, like guerrilla warfare, occasional forays, retreat, and consolidation. The conservative prohibitions against women's education contribute to making silence and stealth Rasha Sundari's only weapons. She describes how she steals a page of her husband's Chaitanya Bhagavat, a religious text, and then compares it with the letters that her son has been writing in his primer for school, and then tries to remember what she had learned in childhood from hearing the boys at their lessons. She is, however, 25 years old before she learns to read the Chaitanya Bhagavat, and she is past 40 before she can write. As she says, in order to write, you need so many things: paper, quill, an inkstand, somebody to instruct you. It is only after widowhood, when she comes to live with her son and is relieved of the immense burden of housework that she'd borne almost from the start of her married life, that she can write her history. Now, what is the pattern of this life writing? It is actually, in some ways, a religious text that she produces. The first part of Amar Jibon consists of 16 compositions. It's added to with 15 other compositions in 1897 in the second part. Each composition is preceded by a devotional poem expressing intense Vaishnavite faith in a loving deity. The first part is more directly autobiographical. In the second, religious devotion predominates. Since Rashasundari's life was untouched by the waves of reform that were sweeping across Bengal in the 19th century, her literary exposure, oral or written, would have been confined to the religious texts that shaped devotional life in Vaishnavite households, such as the Chaitanya Bhagavat and the Chaitanya Charitamrita of Krishnadas Kaviraj. In fact, as Tanika Sarkar argues, Vaishnavite hagiography is the principal model that draws her to tell her story as a living example of the extraordinary grace of the personal deity she worships, Dayamadhav as she calls him, or Krishna himself. Amar Jibon, however, is quite detailed about her social life, about her life. And so it's constructed around two poles of the self: the constricted, painfully burdened, physically exhausting life of the kitchen and the household, and on the other hand, communion with a deity whose love is infinite and emancipatory. And these two poles, so the self-history is in a sense addressed to God. God is the subject of the address of this autobiography. The poles of the domestic and the spiritual are not really spatially distinct. They exist within the same domestic geography, the one always being capable of superimposed upon the other. And I think that this autobiography, although it is, as I said, in certain respects almost a record of religious faith, it is also it contains a great deal by way of personal history, sense of personal anger, resentment and frustration. And in the writing of it, in the forming of a textual self, Rashasundari is taking a kind of risk. She is risking herself ultimately to print, because she knows that what she is writing is intended for publication. That's an extraordinary realization for a 19th century woman who has just learned to read and write. And she is therefore a unique exemplar of women's history in the long 19th century. Now, over a century later, when we arrive at Shunanda Shikdar's memoir of her girlhood, post-partition in a small East Bengal village, many other women have contributed their stories to this interwoven fabric. The genre of personal narrative that allows women to compose their textual identities in two senses: identity as self-sameness, being identified with one's own event history, and identity as sign, being identified as different from others, assumes historical resonance precisely because it makes a claim for women to enter into two related discourses. And these are the philosophical discourse of a self identical with its own event history as claimed by consciousness and memory, and secondly, the political discourse of the person as a forensic category, identifiable as itself and none other, and claiming responsibility for its actions. And both these categories are Lockean categories, as you will recognize from the terms that I've used: consciousness, memory, forensic, and so on. And they are very much 19th century categories of self and person. Now, it allows these narrated, so the act of entering into these discourses by narrating a self and narrating a person, this act allows these narrated identities to enter the archive and to constitute, as I've said, the single most important resource for a whole generation of feminist scholars and researchers working to make women's history public. And the list ranges from relatively privileged public women, such as Sarola Devi Chaudhurani and Cornelia Sorabji, to private individuals like Sharada Sundari, Nistarini, Kailash Pashini, through the great 19th century theatre artist Binodini Dashi, to the political activism of Lakshmi Tilak, and the struggles of Dalit women like Baby Kamble or Urmila Power, and relatively recently, Baby Haldar and Sujata Gidla's controversial family history, Ants Among Elephants. So we have a great deal here, and I just do not have time to even give you a proper sense of the richness of this archive. But at the same time, and this is a point I'd like to emphasize because I won't have time to develop it later, it seems to me that the historical notion of identity produces personhood almost as a tyrannical category tied to a liberal ideology of the self. Feminist studies of the hidden struggles of women in workers' and peasants' movements, as in the oral history work of Kavita Punjabi or that of Sharmila Rege, Gail Omvet, the Stree Shakti Sangathan, and so on, have in common with people's history a much stronger sense of the collective and its place in the historical process. It's worth remembering this and asking ourselves what collective biography would look like as opposed to this idea of the individual self and its preservation against the ruins of time. The Brahmo scholar Shivnath Shastri composed, and I'm turning now to biography, the Brahmo scholar Shivnath Shastri composed not only his own autobiography, but a classic account of 19th century intellectual history built around a single male individual, Ramtanu Lahiri Totkalin Bongo Samaj, 1903. Nothing of the same kind has been attempted for a woman, with the possible exception of Uma Chakravarti's biography of Pandita Ramabai, which actually, is almost 300 pages of that is about Maharashtrian patriarchy, and only about 50 pages is about, the last chapter is about Pandita Ramabai. It is called the life and rewriting history, the life and times of Pandita Ramabai. And I think that Uma Chakravarti is really doing something quite deliberate there. She's writing history, and then she's putting Ramabai right at the end of that. But as I was saying, by contrast with autobiography, biographies of women in South Asia are relatively scarce and inadequate. A notable exception is Harihar Das's monumental The Life and Letters of Toru Dotto, Oxford 1921, with a foreword by H.A.L. Fisher in which he states that in the long history of the contact and interfusion of East and West, I doubt whether there is a figure more encouraging and significant than Toru Dutt. This is, quite an interesting, and it is really a monumental work and written like a proper biography. And this is followed by a much shorter work, Guru Sadai Dutt's biography of his wife, Saroj Nalini, titled A Woman of India, and published by the Woolfs, Leonard and Virginia Woolf, at the Hogarth Press in 1929, same year as A Room of One's Own. Over the succeeding 90 years or so, I think we can trace three major types: a few very serious scholarly biographies of exceptional women who already have a place in official history, such as Suparna Guptu's and Richard Sorabji's biographies of Cornelia Sorabji, Meera Kosambi and Uma Chakravarti's work on Pandita Ramabai, although the first is editorial and the second, as I said, is a critique of Maharashtrian patriarchy, and some contributions to music history, such as Vikram Sampath's work on Gauhar Jan and T.J.S. George's biography of M.S. Subbulakshmi. And This is the first, serious biography. The second is hagiography, both political and religious, usually unscholarly and inextensive, such as Christian Lives of Pandita Ramabai and Padmini Sengupta's biographies of various public figures, even of her own mother, Kamala Satyanathan. And finally, exemplary brief accounts of pioneer or famous women of India, published in series that are usually designed for public instruction or the instruction of the young, school children, and so on. And in politics, sport, and music, finally, there appears to be a natural progression today from the relatively idealizing heroic life to the postmodern film genre of the biopic. And, the more documentary film life, like Raja Mitra's Ekti Jibon, or for that matter, Shyam Benegal's Bhumika, is relatively rare. You have more of this biopic kind of thing that is being proposed for famous figures in sport and music and maybe politics and so on. But instead of surveying this field, which I have just very, very briefly indicated, I want to focus on two contrasted biographies, illustrating some of the entanglements that I referred to at the start between the record of an individual life and the idea of a history that might also be a disciplinary history in which that life is placed. How does writing lives confer significance in terms of an aesthetics and politics of the text, and how can it negotiate historical absence or lack? My first example is a short account, 57 pages only, of the life and work of the social anthropologist Iravati Karve, 1905 to 1970, by Nandini Sundar, contributed to a book called Anthropology in the East, Founders of Indian Sociology and Anthropology, edited by Sundar together with Patricia Uberoi and Satish Deshpande, and published in 2008. The second, a work of a completely different kind, is Maithili Shivaraman's attempted biography of her grandmother, Subbulakshmi, in Fragments of a Life, a Family Archive, published by Zuban, New Delhi, the feminist publisher Zuban, in 2006. Now, starting with Sundar's account, Nandini Sundar's account of Iravati Karve, Sundar's account is not really a biography in that it is only a single chapter in a book devoted to the makers of Indian anthropology, 11 men and 1 woman, which may be par for the course in a number of disciplinary histories. It is like those short biographical essays that circulate online or are printed in slender booklets to encourage and inspire later generations of scholars. But quite apart from my own long-standing admiration for Iravati Karve, I think that the book itself addresses some questions that we want to put to ourselves here. In their introduction, Uberoi, Sundar and Deshpande cite André Bethey on the importance of disciplinary history, given the notorious brevity of institutional memory in India. And they say, once key players have left the scene or the chain of apostolic succession has ruptured, there appear to be few institutional mechanisms for preserving professional history. There's no centralized archive, no long-term plan for smaller museums and collections, not even a university database for preserving syllabi, teaching plans, project reports, and so on. Historicizing the disciplinary past is a neglected activity, so our editors say, and I would very much agree with them. And new generations of scholars forgetfully start over again as if they knew nothing of the findings of their predecessors. But surely it is important that the editors seek to redress this amnesia, not by writing a history of sociology and anthropology, since they bracket the two disciplines, but by producing biographical accounts of 12 leading scholars who had a key role in shaping not only the disciplines but also the institutions where sociology and anthropology were practiced. In fact, the editors mention histories of anthropology and sociology, like Vidyarthi's 2-volume History of Anthropology or Ramakrishna Mukherjee's Sociology of Indian Sociology. These are books from 1978, 1979, and so on. And they discuss the evolution of Indian anthropology and sociology in terms of phases, key figures, and so on. But why do these editors then adopt biography as their chosen mode of doing history? And the editors answer this question by citing Max Gluckman to the effect that the production of knowledge is a social process mediated by and through individuals. Anthropology, they say, quote, I quote from them, more than other disciplines is embodied in the lives of its practitioners and their experiences in the field involving a variety of relationships with others. They propose thus that the means for a historical anthropology of anthropology, like Mukherjee's sociology of sociology, is biography. Personal documents and unpublished notes might uncover the hidden history of anthropology and allow us to read against the grain phrases familiar to us from people's history or women's history projects. Disappointingly, though, they admit that although there's material aplenty for psychobiography here, sibling rivalries, Oedipal struggles, loss, pain, disappointment, rebellion, domination, abjection, and so on, these personality conflicts have remained very much in the background of their study and are certainly not projected as the motor of professional development. And this is the case with their project. So the essays assume, they say, the unity of the self and indeed even the Western notion of the person, as Clifford Geertz, for example, defines it, very celebrated definition, which I needn't cite to this audience, a bounded, unique and more or less integrated motivational and cognitive universe, and so on. The most they offer by way of concession to the distinctively Indian context of their inquiries is that they also wish to make that self's relation with others and with society as visible as possible, to frame their subjects within family, kin, caste, religion, and gender. Now, in this respect, then, the essays are sociological, answering the call of their own discipline. But they say, too, that the task itself that they set themselves was a chastening experience. And in the case of Nandini Sundar's work on Iravati Karve, the lack of lasting influence of her subject in the discipline itself, in disciplinary history, would mean that she would be marginalized in, or even perhaps absent from, disciplinary history of anthropology. Why is she absent? Was it because Karve practiced anthropology in the classical sense, a four-field approach including archaeology, prehistory, physical anthropology, and so on? Is it because of this? Is it because that she wrote too much in Marathi, that is, in the vernacular? Were her students not distinguished enough to take the plum jobs abroad and in India? Was it that she taught in non-metropolitan institutions, spent most of her teaching life at the Deccan College in Pune? Was she a woman in a profession dominated by men? That, of course, is key. Even the labor of biography, it is clear, will not provide the solution to disciplinary immortality. If we turn from the summary observations of the introduction to the chapter on Karve itself, we find precisely these concerns re-articulated even as Sundar recovers the contours of Karve's life as an acclaimed woman of letters in Marathi, a Sanskrit scholar, a paleontologist, a serologist, an anthropometrist, a collector of folk songs, and a professional academic over, 50 years and more. So, expectedly, the essay is much more an intellectual history than a personal life story, though Sundar makes the unexpected observation that because Karve was a woman, her life was fuller than it could have been had she been male. In brief snatches, Karve emerges as a vivid, unconventional personality with strong opinions, an exciting and difficult person, hospitable, insatiably curious, given to extensive field trips away from her family, frank to the point of rudeness. She wasn't on speaking terms with the great historian Didi Kosambi, and passionate about a multitude of interests. And she also, of course, Sundar helps us by tracing the the development of Karve's own work, her mastery of Sanskrit, in the way she's using classical texts to substantiate her claims, her interest in human origins and migrations, her surprisingly contemporary surveys of women, dam-displaced populations, weekly markets, pastoralists, and the Vari or Varkari pilgrimage to Pandharpur, which she rather inaccurately regarded as the basis of a Maharashtrian identity. But of course, On the Road was the first essay by Karve that I ever read, and I have never forgotten it. Now, Sunders' biographical sketch of Karve, for it is no more than that, does have something to say, though in a limited way, about the function of biography in history, particularly in women's history. It places Iravati Karve within the disciplinary changes and battles that took place during her lifetime in anthropology, and it shows her caught up in an intricate web of relations, rivalries, and disputes, though focusing more on her professional than her family life. It also indicates some ideological affiliations, even an incipient feminism, but doesn't expand on these. Politics is a serious omission. Sundar quotes from a paper given by Karve at the Asian Relations Conference in Delhi in 1947, a historic occasion where the seeds of the non-aligned movement were sown, but we don't really learn much more about it apart from the Islamophobic tone of the address. Given that Sundar had access to all of Karve's papers, some of course were absent or missing, she makes references to these missing documents, some missing witnesses. Nevertheless, one is left with a sense of sadness, of a sense of a biography that could have been, but is not actually delivered by Sundar. We feel that even this lack of disciplinary influence and the obsolescence of Karve's scholarly methods, issues that Sundar so clearly indicates and that would see her marginalized in the future, might have been countered by the richness of significance that a life writer delivering a self or rescuing that self from what E.P. Thompson called the enormous condescension of posterity might have produced. It's for this reason that Sundar's account, precisely that kind of exercise in recovery and redressal that disciplinary history requires, nevertheless leaves behind an effect of sadness. It's on this note that I want now to turn to a book deliberately titled Fragments of a Life, the biography of an unknown woman who had wanted to be part of the stirring events of her time, but remains excluded from the historical record of India's struggle for independence. This is the women's and Dalit rights activist Maithili Shivaraman's grandmother, Lakshmi, 1897 to 1978, that is almost an exact contemporary of Iravati Karve, but far removed from her in terms of education and opportunities. Sivaraman found her grandmother's diary, covering only 2 years, 1924 to 1926, written in English, but only 2 years out of a life of 81 years, with other memorabilia in a blue tin trunk after Lakshmi's death, and the book is an attempted reconstruction not simply of a past life, but a past time. Lakshmi was married at 11, bore her first child at 14. She longed to study and learnt Tamil and Sanskrit and English from reading to her grandfather, and some Bengali through her love for Tagore's poetry. She was not formally educated beyond the 3rd school year. She collected books in later life, read widely and eclectically in English, Tamil, and Sanskrit. She read literature, philosophy, psychology, science, travel, and so on, from Tagore and Subramaniam Bharati to Freud, Marx, Einstein's On the Meaning of Relativity, and Edgar Snow's Red Star over China. She deeply admired Gandhi and Tagore. She went to art exhibitions, but her life was unhappy. 2 of her sons died in infancy. She suffered epileptic fits. Her husband was cold and didn't sanction treatment for her illness, believing her to be mad. She was forced to leave home to put her daughter Pankajam into school, and towards the end of her life, she lapsed into clinical depression and withdrawal. Some of those present here may recall that the feminist historian Uma Chakravarti, who wrote the afterword to Shivaraman's book, made a short documentary film on Lakshmi's life, a quiet little entry, 2010, tragically succeeded by another film called Fragments of a Past, 2013, where the figure in focus is Shivaraman herself, who, unlike her grandmother, lived a full political life but was losing her memory to Alzheimer's disease. Not only do these paired films, which I viewed when Chakravarti presented them at successive women's studies workshops, provide a cinematic supplement to the textual archive of Fragments of a Life, but the book, in a sense, stands at the center of a collective reconstruction of women's history. And this, I think, is as important and memorable as the text itself. Maithili Shivaraman was drawn to political activism by the massacre of Dalit landless laborers at the village of Venmani, Keel Venmani in Tamil Nadu. And in Chakravarti's second documentary, Fragments of a Past, Shivaraman's loss of memory is compensated by the rallying round her of her daughter, husband, and comrades in the struggle within and outside the Communist Party. While her grandmother's diary had already figured in a chapter of Kamala Vishveshwaran's much earlier book, Fictions of a Feminist Ethnography, University of Minnesota Press, 1994, almost 10 years before these projects. So Shivaraman's own retrieval of a family archive is sandwiched between a foreword by Geeta Hariharan and an afterword by Uma Chakravarti, with other women activists and researchers like her own daughter, Kalpana Karunakaran, or the historian V. Geeta, adding testimonies, recollections, and reviews that hedge the margins of the text, print, and online. So the book Fragments, despite the lessons of loss, exclusion, and silencing that it has for us, and even despite the poignant echoing of those absences in the memory loss that Shivaraman refers to in the film of which she is the subject, is in its textual history and against the odds a triumph of the women's archive. But what kind of triumph, and in what way is a life understood or retrieved? In the afterword, titled The Blue Tin Trunk, Uma Chakravarti wrote, almost like Carolyn Steedman, she is a professional historian, of the paradigm shift that was required within the discipline of history to accommodate the efforts of feminist historians to bring into focus those non-actors who have been left out of history's mega events and who may have struggled and failed to transform their own lives. And she speaks also of the way in which Maithili Shivaraman does this effort of reconstruction, working on scraps of paper, book lists, because this woman does not write her own life. In fact, she is remarkably reserved and actually doesn't say anything about herself. She just notes down book titles, and she has library slips, borrowed books, and so on. So Chakravarti asks what meaning should Subbalakshmi's aborted existence might have, what place she occupies in the history of women or in the history of a colonized nation's struggle for freedom. In the structure-agency tension that shapes human lives, Subbalakshmi exercises little agency beyond her struggle to educate her daughter, to wear khadi, she wore khadi all her life, and to read and think, though we will never know what she thought. So such questions had been asked earlier from a different disciplinary perspective by Kamala Vishveshwaran, who used Subbalakshmi's diary and memorabilia to ask what is the truth of a life and how may it be read. And in order to ask what that truth might be, Vishveshwaran prints not just her account reconstructed from the evidence in the blue tin trunk, but also a much more adulatory account of her mother by Pankajam, the daughter of Subbalakshmi. And she places Pankajam's objections to her own historical reconstruction within this ethnographical chapter that she produces on Subbalakshmi. So she has these contesting versions of the history of her subject. And if Chakravarti suggests that Maithili Shivaraman is producing, with creativity and passion, something of her own story from her grandmother's minimalist account, so too Vishveshwaran observes that Pankajam, with great skill and compassion, has narrated her own history through her mother's life. Now, I make these points not in order to offer the banal conclusion that every biography is an exercise in autobiography, which is, not worth saying, but to suggest that if you think of the way in which the attempt to recover the life of Maithili Shivaraman's grandmother has become a thicket of closely interwoven narratives by women writers and artists, testifying, like Geeta Hariharan in her foreword, to the jolt of recognition with which they approached the subject and the anxious concern with which they returned to it, like Uma Chakravarti with her afterword and her paired films, or how they examine and supplement what meager evidence exists. What emerges is a distinctive way of understanding lives and doing history. It is not that the idea of the singular, unrepeatable life, the person whose individual existence must be set against other people and events, has disappeared. On the contrary, it's the focus of inquiry, even as we come up against the sad recognition of how much is missing in the personal record. But at the same time, it's as though the search for that life, or for others like it, can become a collective endeavor, and that multiple searches across generations and media can produce the intricate networks and meshes that constitute women's history, making it not marginal to mainstream history, as Uma Chakravarti suggests, but its thorny undergrowth. In this case at least, and in many others like it, the formal, classical endeavor of biography must be seen to fail. But this does not mean that it could not succeed in another instance. In my earlier instance of Iravati Karve, it might well have succeeded. But here it is through the collective constitution of the archive, as other narratives, other testimonies are added to the record of a life only partially recoverable in itself, that the sense of a women's history emerges as an interworked series where meaningfulness is generated not so much by the portrait as by the search and by a process of aggregation rather than singling out. And therefore, the fragments of Subbulakshmi's life and the fragments of Sivaraman's past speak to each other of loss, but also of recovery. And I would like to conclude by showing you just two little extracts from the films, the two films that... Maybe a little... Is it moving at all? I think it's not. Yes.
The Salt Agitation of 1930. Struggles for freedom, both individual and collective. Regimes of power over a people and at home. Somewhere in the midst of this, a woman struggled to be and left behind bits of paper.
And the next one. This is another film, the one about Maithili Shivaraman, who is the granddaughter of Subbulakshmi and wrote her life, but at the, yes, again sound, yeah.
I know, I even have a photo, somebody took a photo of her with me. Yeah, where did you meet her? When you see her or
you went to meet her for a specific purpose. Also, there was one person from CPI also came with you and Krishnama. All three of you went from that place to a village.
No.
Do you remember that?
If I look at my well-being book, I could see if there is anything in the earlier past about well-being. that I had gone with these people. So very, very good. I might have gone with them, is it? I did. You did go there. I did? You went with them. Is that what is written in it? It's not written. I have myself written? This is what is memory loss.
You can stop it. Okay. So this is a really very extraordinary and moving picture of this woman who is losing her memory, and it's 50 minutes, more than 56 minutes of people trying to put this life together, her life, which is also a kind of supplement to her grandmother's unlived. Thank you.